welcome back to the Warbird Mistress with this video on the immortal Curtiss P-40. This video was dedicated to the memory of David Vopat, with whom I once had the privilege of tinkering around with the P-40 after I announced the 2018 Planes of Fame air show in Chino with Kevin Thompson. And he lauded my announcing, and we chatted then and on Facebook after that I'd be good at speaking or doing a series, so I hope I'm not making a liar out of him with these. The P-40 is one of the first aircraft I remember learning about when I was very little. I had a copy of Ernest R. McDowell's book on the P-40 from the famous aircraft series, and it's vastly underappreciated, and I've always felt that it was because of its alleged poor performance against the Zeke in the early months of the Pacific War. In reality, she was not only an excellent fighter for her day, but she helped Britain and her dominions in the fight against the Italians and Germans in North Africa, and held her own in the Pacific. Famous for being the aircraft of the Flying Tigers, she could meet the Bf-109 on her own terms through the first years of the war. She countered the Japanese in China, ending years of air supremacy. She wreaked havoc on Italian assets and protected Australia and the Solomons from Japanese bombers as she flew under American, British and Commonwealth, Chinese, Dutch, Soviet, Brazilian, Turkish, Finnish, and Egyptian colors. And it all started with the humble P-36A. In 1938, the Army Air Corps received the Curtiss Hawk Model 75, dubbed the P-36 Mohawk. The latest in a line of Hawk fighters, the sleek monoplane with the powerful 1,050 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830-17 twin Wasp 14-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine. She flew it up to 313 miles per hour and cruised at 270 miles per hour at a time when biplanes were just being replaced by aircraft like the Hurricane and the Bf-109. With 2 machine guns, 130 caliber and 150 caliber, she would be upgraded to carry 4 machine guns and have an even more powerful motor as she served with French, Dutch, British, Finnish, and Commonwealth forces well into the war. An inline engine would be fitted to one Model 75P, and this would give birth to one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II, the Curtiss P-40. The XP-37, or a Model 75I, was a P-36A with a turbo-supercharged 1150 horsepower Allison V1710-11 motor, 2 radiator scoops on the sides of the nose, and a standard armament of 130 caliber and 150 caliber gun. The problems were the pilot couldn't see, and the supercharger wouldn't work properly crammed into such a small space. Then there are the 13 YP-37 examples with an even more extended nose. Again, poor supercharger function and poor pilot visibility meant these too went nowhere. The 10th P-36A was modified to the XP-40. With a ventrally positioned radiator and the cockpit moved forward, most of the problems were solved, as did fitting an 1150 horsepower Allison V1710-19 that lacked a turbo supercharger. The weight savings meant the cockpit could be positioned farther ahead to make up for the change in center of gravity, solving the visibility issues. The revised XP-40 was built with a more effective radiator at the chin, 250 caliber guns rather than 130 and 150, and sturdier landing gear. A full 50 miles per hour speedier than the Hawk, Britain and France jumped on the aircraft, and the Army Air Corps followed in April 1939 with the largest order for a combat aircraft to date, 524 examples. As a parallel project, in March 1939, the 4th production P-36A was modified to accept a Pratt & Whitney R1830-31 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, which was rated at 1,050 horsepower as the XP-42. With only a 315 mile per hour top speed and a 730 mile range, she proved inferior to the P-40, but it does show the adaptability of the Hawk 75, if nothing less. The P-40, called the Hawk 81A1 by the Armée de l'Air and the Tomahawk Mark I by the RAF, had Allison V1710-33 motors rated at 1,040 horsepower, about 100 fewer horsepower than the prototype's -19 had. Of the original lot, 140 meant for France went to the RAF due to the armistice having been signed in June of 1940, and 200 went to the U.S. Army Air Corps. 40 more were fitted with 4 guns rather than the 250 caliber guns in American models, and were called the P-40G. The RAF examples also had 4 guns, but replaced the 30 caliber Brownings which the French had left in place with their own .303 caliber. This was seen in most cases in the Tomahawk designated lineage. However, these had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and very light armament, and were thus sent to the Gladiator-equipped North African squadrons in order to free up other aircraft for home defense. The rest of the initial order of P-40s were designated P-40Bs by the Army Air Corps. These were the Hawk 81A2 or Tomahawk Mark II or Mark IIA in British service. A total of 241 were built. These had 4 rifle-caliber guns in the wings, and 131 went into American service, while 110 went to the RAF. She was heavier than the original P-40 and had a slower climb rate, but could achieve a 730-mile operational and 12,030-mile maximum range. Of the 131 American models, 62 were destroyed at Pearl Harbor, together with 11 40Cs. This one in the photo is the only surviving fighter from Pearl Harbor and is owned by the Collins Foundation. The P-40C, or Tomahawk 2B, is most famous for the 100 diverted from an RAF order and sent to China for the American Volunteer Group, or Flying Tigers. She had a modern SCR-274N radio, self-sealing fuel tanks, and for the first time, 6 guns. 4 30 caliber guns were in the wings, and 2 50 caliber guns were in the nose. The British examples had 6 303s instead. She could reach a speedy 345 miles per hour, and with the exception of those examples sent to China, had a 52-gallon drop tank. This would lead to the AVGs being designated Model 82A2s, even though they were all Model 82A3s. This would become a standard feature and gave the P-40 the duration she needed to operate successfully in European and North African airspace. The United States Army Air Corps had 193 of this example, the RAF had 950, and from the RAF examples, 195 of those were sent to the Soviets, and many others were sent to Commonwealth squadrons. This, for example, is a RAF Tomahawk 2B from the RAF order, which went first to a New Zealand squadron and later on to the Turkish Air Force in November 1941. The P-40C would be the last of the Hawk 81 models. In 1940, the P-46 was designed to replace the P-40. 2 examples were made, and they first flew in November 1941. The British ordered them off the drawing board and gave them the name Kittyhawk. With an 1150 horsepower liquid-cooled Allison V17-1039 V12 engine, they struggled to reach their top speed of 355 miles per hour and had a range of a mere 325 miles. The 65 pounds of armor, self-sealing tanks, and smaller, cramped airframe combined to make a product inferior to the P-40. The 10 machine guns would only have weighed her down even more, as she was planned to have 2 50 caliber nose guns and 8 30 caliber wing guns. The design was shelved. While the prototype for the Mustang, the North American NA-73X, was made after North American bought the P-40's and P-46's wind tunnel and in-flight aerodynamic data sets, the rumor that the NA-73 was a rip-off is unfounded, as the design was nearly finalized before the data was purchased. The design similarities are no greater than between the Mustang and the Hurricane, BF-109, Bloch MB-151, or Maquis C-202. The name Kittyhawk would be given to the Model 87A, Kittyhawk Mark I or P-40D in American service. Delays in the P-46 program and no demonstrable advantage over the P-40C led to an improved P-40 with this 1,150 horsepower V17-1039 engine. This F-Series engine differed from the C-Series engine of the Model 81 Hawks in that it drove the propeller via a gearbox, while the latter directly drove the propeller, thus improving engine efficiency. In fact, the D model was nearly an entirely different aircraft. The wing, nose, and landing gear were all new, and the fuselage had been trimmed and slimmed to maximize aerodynamic potential. Even with leak-proofed self-sealing tanks, 65 pounds of armor for the pilot, and more armor surrounding the engine, a top speed of 355 miles per hour finished off this first of the Model 87s. With the new streamlining, nose guns were abandoned, and 8 30 caliber wing guns were the intended armament. However, 20 of 560 British examples, including this one, the first one off the production line, had 4 50 caliber wing guns. All others had 6 50 caliber wing guns, a notably heavy armament for the Commonwealth, which was still addicted to the light and largely ineffectual .303 round. These mostly all saw service in Britain and her Commonwealth, and only 21 were in U.S. service. Many of these came from the original order for the French Armée de l'Air to replace her P-36 Mohawks, as France fell before they could be delivered. Fittingly, it would be later models of the P-40 flying in the Escadron de Chasse du Centre Lafayette, the inheritors of the Escadrille Lafayette heritage, which would face Vichy French P-36s over Tunisia. The next big model for the Americans would be the P-40E and Kittyhawk Mark I-A. The U.S. Army Air Corps received 820 examples, and 1,500 were designated for Lend-Lease, mostly to the RAF but also to other nations. With 650 caliber guns in the wings, there were issues with the feed which led to jamming, but these were resolved within a few months. Later production models had larger vertical stabilizers to compensate for engine torque and issues with trim adjustment when changing speeds. The Warhawk had an unfavorable performance profile above Angel's 12, making them poor interceptors. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe had learned to try to dive on them to gain the advantage and then keep the advantage with the newer Bf-109Fs in a dogfight with the P-40. An attempt to add a turbo-supercharged Allison V-1710 led to the P-40J being designed, but it was never built. The turbo-supercharger would not fit in the sleek airframe, as this photograph's angle demonstrates, and the engines were needed for the P-38 Lightning. The performance issue with the Allison was solved with the adoption of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the P-40F, or Kittyhawk Mark II. This was the first to be properly named the Warhawk in American service. The American-manufactured Merlin, a Packard V1650-1, was fitted to the P-40F. However, the engine was powerful enough to affect the stability, so the tail had to be lengthened by almost 2 feet, giving the Warhawk a distinctive profile once again, beginning with the P-40F5. The RAF would receive 150 of this model through Lend-Lease out of the approximately 1,550 built. The last order before Pearl Harbor, and what was supposed to be the last of the P-40 models, was the P-40K, or Kittyhawk Mark III. This was not dissimilar from the Allison-powered P-40E from which it was developed, but had a better low-altitude performance thanks to the improved 1,325 horsepower V1710-73, a larger vertical stabilizer to compensate for the torque, and improved ammunition storage. Rather than 600 meant for China, those models went to the U.S. Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force. The K-10 variant had the longer empennage of the P-40F. A total of 1,653 were made, including 335 of the K-10 variant and 351 which went to the RAF. Of those, 175 were sent to other Allied nations instead, like these two here from the Força Aérea Brasileira, the reformed Brazilian Air Command, which combined the Aviação Militar and the Aviação Naval of the Forças Aéreas Nacionais into a single force based on the model of the RAF and FAA. I mention this because while the Primeiro Grupo de Aviação de Caça is one of the most famous Brazilian units, and notably served in Italy, where it more than made up for its small size with the incredible success rate in P-47s, the Grupo first trained with the P-40s in Panama before switching to the Thunderbolt. This is not a photo of that unit, rather it is of another squadron flying over the city of Natal in Rio Grande do Norte. In fact, you can just make out what looks like a bit of the Rio Potengi. Now, other Brazilian units continued to use the P-40K, and the last ones retired from frontline service in 1954. These would be the last P-40s in active service in any nation. The P-40K was supposed to be replaced by the Curtiss P-60, which had grown to hardly resemble the P-40 in any of its incarnations. But such was not the case, and she never reached production. Another Merlin-powered Warhawk instead arrived, the Hawk 87B3, or P-40L, a lightened version of the notably heavy P-40F. The L had less armor, fewer rounds per gun, and at least 220 of the 1,013 built, only 4 50 caliber machine guns rather than 6. While at least 53 had Allison V1710-81 motors due to a shortage of Merlins, these were not the export models, and nearly all export L models had 6 guns. The export version was given the Mark II designation for 100 examples, and 160 examples were designated the Mark III, despite all being the Hawk 86B-3 model. At least 1,066 of this model, the P-40M, were built. In Commonwealth service, she was known confusingly as the Kittyhawk Mark III, as was the P-40L. With the new 1,360 horsepower Allison V1710-81s, and new cooling grill, carburetor filters, ailerons, and fuel pumps and filters, this model was a minor improvement. Of these, 466 were built for Commonwealth and other forces, while 600, plus those few to be converted to two-seat trainers, were in American service. After the M was the P-40N, or a Kittyhawk Mark IV in Commonwealth service. This particular example in a photo of my own at Plains of Fame in Chino is one of 5,220 built of this variant. Of those, 586 were for overseas service, mostly with the RAF, making it the most numerous of versions. The first 400, the P-40N1 examples, were the fastest of the P-40s, reaching 378 miles per hour at altitudes below Angel's 12, as the Allison was still hampered at higher altitudes. There were also many subtypes, which is why this model received the designations Hawk 87V and 87W. The first 400 were a significantly lighter version of the P-40M that had aluminium armor and other fittings and only 4 guns. This was followed by the P-40N5, which had 6 guns and bomb racks, which could also hold drop tanks. The rest would all have 6 guns, except for the P-40N10, which was the winterized version, and only 100 were built. The P-40N20, of which 1,523 were built, had a V1710-99 upgrade, and the 220 P-40N40s would see the even more powerful Allison V1710-115 motor. This variety also had metal-covered ailerons. While the N would be the most produced version, it would also be the last variant. The P-40P was supposed to be an N with a Merlin engine, but as none were available, this never came to be, and they were completed with Allisons and given the M designation. John Fallis Susie here is also a P-40N of the N5CU variety. First manufactured in 1943 in Buffalo and restored to airworthy status, she's also the first vintage warbird with which I got to get really up close and personal. I even managed to keep my dress clean while being shown all the best little bits by David Vopat of eternal memory and the rest of the crew, including Mr. Fallis, who is an absolute doll. Being still a farm girl at heart, you didn't think I'd let up a chance to get a little grease over my hands, did you? Now that was the last model produced, but there were 2 more modifications. This single example of the P-40N was fitted with the bubble canopy. While dubbed an XP-40N or P-40XN, in reality she had no official designation. The second set of modifications, and the final attempt to keep the P-40 relevant, was the P-40Q. 3 modified airframes were marked as the P-40Q-1, -2, and -3. Each of these had only 4 guns, and a water-injected Allison V1710-121, which made it the fastest of all the P-40s, even if it was not a production model. They were able to reach 422 miles per hour. The P-40Q-1 was a modified P-40K-10 with a long nose and a 4-blade prop. The -2 was also a P-40K, but with a longer tail, small chin scoop, and bubble canopy. Finally, the P-40N-25, modified into the XP-40Q-3, betrays the rival Curtiss had in mind, the late model Mustang. The P-40 had served alongside the Mustang since those early days in North Africa, but the P-40Q was inferior to the P-47, P-51, and other late war aircraft. The Warhawk had seen its days, and no Q model was ever adopted. Finally, this discussion would be remiss without mentioning the single example of the so-called twin-engine P-40 that usually pops on the internet every couple of weeks. The airframe is that of a P-40C, and the cockpit is a late model Hawk 75s. The mock-up, which had no name, was done in 1942 and likely never flew, as Army Air Force records show it only to have been a mock-up, and it was written off on the 27th of February 1943. As no twin-engine pursuit plane was thought of by Curtiss except for the XP-72, which looked nothing like this, why it was built is still up to the imagination. Had this ever been a real plane, one might hope the pilot was never attacked from the side, eh? That brings us to the end of the P-40's lineage. While many volumes have been written by pilots on taking the Warhawk into combat, the differences from model to model are a nuance lost on those who see it as an outdated, unmaneuverable, stodgy, early war fighter, when in reality it was a modern, sleek, sprightly, and deadly aircraft. While she may have come up short against the Zero, so too did famous aircraft like the Spitfire and Hurricane. She was a machine of her day and likely Curtiss's most famous aircraft, and would become a flying legend in the hands of thousands of men who took to battle with the Axis powers. Once more, thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying my creations, please share this video with your friends and your groups if you liked it, and I do hope you share your comments and thoughts below. Please also consider supporting Warbird Mistress. Your contributions really do help with some of the costs that are involved. Subscriptions are a mere $3, and as soon as I start to get a few more subscribers, Patreon patrons will also have access to exclusive content. In the meantime, remember to check in and see what you may have missed, and make sure to set your alerts to receive regular new content. This is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Take care.